So it's nice to see so many people again week after week. Once again, I'm going to try and be in charge of the tech for tonight. I've actually just dropped a link into the chat box where you can sign up to our email list directly if you don't want to miss any upcoming talks or get informed about other developments, as Robin mentioned. So that we will be recording this like the previous talks. You will be able to find the recording on YouTube afterwards. Do feel free to turn your camera off if you don't want to be seen and things like that. For now, we're going to have a talk first. Just so you know, you will be able to drag around the pictures if it does obscure anything on the slides. Otherwise, I'll hand back over to Robin, who will be chairing the session today. Back to you, Robin.
Right, thank you, David. So David will be the techie in the background whilst we manage the talk. One other thing just to add, some of you may have noticed, those of you who registered via Eventbrite, that there is now the option of making a donation towards the costs of running these things. And what we are proposing to do, the talks are entirely free for anybody who needs them to be free, but we wanted to create the options of donating because we're intending, well, partly because many organizations want groups like us to be income generating in a way, but mainly we're thinking to have every month a charity of the month that we will donate a quarter of whatever income we get to. So we have some benefit to the local community as well as maintaining and developing this particular activity. And the charity of this month is going to be the Backup Trust, which is the choice of our guest speaker today, which is our link. So, without further ado, as they say, I'm going to hand you over now to Radio Cornwall's, what should we say, Radio Cornwall's silent hero. Kevin and I have met virtually, visually now, just in the last 5 minutes or so, but it's a voice that is so familiar from me, so for many, many, many mornings, and hopefully for you too. So enough of that, I will hand over now to Kevin, who's going to be talking about the challenges of weather forecasting.
Thank you, Robin. The first thing I'm going to do is to share my screen, so stand by. Right, hopefully you can all see that, starting with the welcome slide, if you call it that. It's a great pleasure to talk to you all this evening. I do a lot of these sort of talks in the community, WI groups, men's groups, all sorts of people, but this is an absolute first for me. A Zoom virtual presentation is another one to add to the tick-off list as accomplished. First of all, an icebreaker. On mouse. There we go.
Now let's have a look at the weather, Louise. You're right.
Sorry.
I think we've lost her. I'll tell you what, we'll do that. Come back to me on camera 3. Now, let's get a weather update. Here is Louise Lear.
Thank you, Simon. Good evening, everybody. I'll try and keep it together because it's not a laughing matter with the weather in Scotland. Today's sorry. It's been pretty wet and windy with the strongest of the gusts of wind across Scotland and Northern Ireland. In fact, we've seen gale force gusts into Wales and across central parts of England. We've had... Sorry.
That's enough of that. I still, to this day, have no idea why she was so tickled with that. But it's an occupational hazard. If you work in media, every now and then something will just trigger the giggle button, and corpsing is what we call it. And we've all done it. We've been there. Fortunately, the audience seems to like it, whether it's on radio or TV. Now, this is a rather handsome fella you see in front of him. Front of me. This is me 37 years ago, and you can see I'm wearing the uniform of Royal Navy officer. Why is that significant in a talk about meteorology and weather forecasting in Cornwall? Well, that's how I started my trade as a Royal Navy officer with the intention of becoming a meteorologist, a weather forecaster. And the Navy are the only service out of the HM Armed Forces to actually have a uniformed meteorology, as it was then, and oceanography service as well. So I'm also an oceanographer, although a little bit lapsed as far as that goes. So that was 1983. That means I've been in this sort of occupation for 37 years, on and off. At the Navy, I left full-time in 2009, but I went straight into the Naval Reserve, but obviously I joined the BBC in 2009 as well, and continued forecasting with the radio for both Devon and Cornwall. So a few pictures of how the Navy used me. I wouldn't say used and abused me over the while. First ship, Royal Fleet Auxiliary by the name of Engadine. Warships. Why do warships have weather forecasters on board? It's primarily all about aviation, and the primary thing there is all about tactical advantage, getting tactical advantage over your enemy. It's there it is, it's stark, but that's why forecasters are required. It's nothing to do with what's the weather going to be like for sunbathing. It's all about tactics and operations. So that's why you do it on board a warship. You tend to do a lot of other jobs, mind you. It's not just that, to keep you busy. Fleet auxiliaries, tankers, also have them on board. I've done some time on these fellas going across the ocean. Another warship, don't know if anyone recognises that one, it's long gone, unless you happen to be in Portsmouth Harbour recently, which is HMS Bristol. And I mentioned other jobs we do. This is me, flight deck officer, waving at the helicopters, very ancient old helicopter there, a Wasp on the flight deck of HMS Bristol. And then latterly, now we're going right forward to 2006 here, the branches merged with hydrographic surveying branch. So I actually became a qualified hydrographic surveyor as well, and did some time on this ship, HMS Echo, which is familiar to maybe quite a few of you local to Falmouth, because she does a lot of her refits in Falmouth together with her sister ship, HMS Enterprise. So this is the sort of thing you do as a hydrographic surveyor, charting essentially, swinging the lead. You've probably heard that phrase. Well, that's where it comes from, charting the depths and the like. And then 2009, I bail out of all of that, and that's a story in itself. But I bail out of all of that, joined the BBC as a radio weather forecaster, covering not just Radio Cornwall, by the way, both Radio Devon and Cornwall. And I do all of that based in Truro. So a lot of people are aware that the BBC went with Meteor Group as their data provider not so long ago. About 2018, in fact, started receiving data from Meteor Group as opposed to the UK Met Office, although there is an irony in that, insofar that Meteor Group actually purchases data from the Met Office and then redistributes it to their customers. So there was a lot of angst when the contract was up for grabs from the BBC, as they're obliged to do under their charter, when it went to Meteor Group. But we see a lot of familiar data as weather forecasters with the BBC, as we did before. So there's very little changed as far as that goes. Well, some will notice changes in things like the apps available on smartphones and the like. However, severe weather warnings remain from the UK Met Office. That is the way it's going to be until something else changes. But if severe weather forecasts will always come from the Met Office as opposed to Meteor Group. So, forecasting the weather in Cornwall, not without its tribulations, problems. My background is the Navy, as I've spoken about. I spent a lot of time at Coldrose, did my training, in fact, at Coldrose, out on the western tip of Cornwall. So I spent a lot of time there, and that means you do pick up a lot of local knowledge, and forecasting the weather in Cornwall does require a lot of local knowledge to understand what is going on. Every time I do these talks and I talk to the audience, they're always very proud of the fact that wherever it may be, ranging from Poliphant to St. Just, very proud of the fact they have a local climate in these areas and that it's very difficult to forecast for. And they're darn right, you know, it is difficult. And on a radio weather forecast, you can't actually mention them all in detail because you'll be there all year. Maybe I need my own weather channel, I'm not so sure, but in 3 minutes or 2 minutes is whatever I have, then you do have to be a little bit broad brush. There are plenty of requirements for these weather forecasts, not just in Cornwall. The need is through a variety of organisations, tourism and leisure, obviously big players in the Cornwall economy. These have a shorter term requirement for forecasts, massively affected by forecasts, if they turn out to be incorrect. In particular, never mind coronavirus, the weather can have a drastic effect on how well tourism performs in our economy as well. And then there's farming, agriculture, another big occupation in our part of the world. Successful, if it's going to be successful in meeting our needs, to be able to plan planting, management, harvesting, and just about all aspects of farming weather are dependent on a forecast. The longer ahead, the better, probably. 5 days is good, but if you can get an accurate forecast for more than 5 days, and that is still quite difficult, we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. Water supply and power, increasingly so. You see a lot of windmills springing up over the Cornish landscape at the moment. They take what they can. Forecast, okay, it's helpful, but at the end of the day, it doesn't affect how much energy is necessarily generated by the wind turbines. Water supply is much more critical. Again, it's not necessarily affected by the forecast. It's a useful planning tool, though, as far as how water is distributed around not just the county, but also the nation. So long-term seasonal forecasts for the management of resources, they do exist, but as yet they're not particularly reliable. A lot of people are making a lot of money out of trying to produce long-term forecasts. So the main players recognize the demand. And I see the main players, Meteor Group, the Met Office, are really trying to fill this gap. Public services, fulfilling travel information, the severe weather forecasts, floods, very much short-term response to forecasts of severe weather. You see from these sort of pictures here, the sort of things that can affect the southwest, ranging from the destruction of the rail line at Dawlish, floods around the coast of Cornwall, and also snowfall across unexpected autumn snowfall, which we've had in a couple of years in talking distance over Cornwall. And then I mentioned the severe weather, the National Severe Weather Warning, very much still coming from the UK Met Office, very much organised into the colour coding we're familiar with, yellow, amber and red. And then there's the Flood Forecasting Centre, kind of works hand in hand, although they are very different types of warning that come through. So the Flood Forecasting Centre comes very much through the Environmental Agency in association with the Met Office. But forecasting in Cornwall, as I said, presents its own very significant problems. One of them is the fact it's a peninsula. It is also probably key into all of this. If you were going across the Atlantic from America, then one of the first places you'd come to is Cornwall. And where does our weather come from? It comes from the west or the southwest. So if you're a band of weather, fronts, whatever, then if you've got a typical west to east airflow, then the first place you're going to encounter is Cornwall. And what sort of information have you got out to the west of us in order to anticipate what we're actually going to receive in terms of weather? So that's the difficulty. And believe me, 30 years ago, when I was still cutting my teeth in the forecasting trade, that was a significant problem. You had very little information. You had a few ships reporting weather conditions. You had maybe a very rudimentary satellite picture. And that was about it. It was very much seat of the pants type of forecasting. So whatever information you can pick up from actual observations to the downwind of us, or upwind rather, is actually very important. It's a very diverse landscape as well. It covers high ground above Bodmin Moor to the lower ground around the coastline. The coast itself is quite an interesting place. Surrounded by warm sea, it's often affected by fog and low cloud. It's data sparse as well, not too many data points, not only over the sea, but around Cornwall itself. And then we got obviously climate change to add into all of that, just to affect things like sea level rises to contend with, albeit that's not a short-term issue yet. So we've often seen differences in forecasts for North Coast, South Coast, inland coastal regions. A lot of people will have been to the North Coast in foggy conditions and then gone to the South Coast and it's gin clear, blue sky, lovely warm day. And the same sort of thing happens in coastal versus inland areas as well. Now, this is one little meteorological lesson hopefully I can take away because it's appropriate. This is actually a satellite picture from some time ago, but it's June 2012 and at the time when we get sea breezes. And you'll notice from the sea breezes they're actually indicated in these blue arrows and they're coming in from opposite directions. So the sea breezes are prone to do, perpendicular to the coastline. Now, when those sea breezes meet inland, they don't just sort of shake hands, pass by and go out the other way. What they do is they come together and they converge. And when they converge, the air rises. And when it rises, that's why you see this strip of cloud developing along the line of Cornwall. And if that air rising is sufficient, it will trigger some of these showers, which are indicated in blue here. It's actually got a meteorological name. It's called the A30 front because it sits pretty much along the A30. So putting a forecast together, a typical day, well, apart from the tea, starting at 4 o'clock in the morning, although that's pre-COVID time, I have to say, with the change in format, I'm actually getting up a whole hour later at 5 o'clock. So a bit of a lie-in, which is kind of nice. But it's very much a simulation of information. When you come to forecast the weather, for Cornwall in particular, you're looking for real-time ground truthing type information. And you're looking at sea in particular. So observations from sea are really useful. They come in many forms. There's observations, these have got a Navy bias, funny old thing, but taking temperatures on board a ship, balloon ascents from a ship, measuring variations of pressure, temperature, wind speed and direction with height, very useful information for a forecaster. And there are several buoys around. These are indicated buoys in the channel and the channel approaches. And these actually provide constant weather reports from these buoys themselves. This is what they look like. They're anchored to the seafloor, but these smaller ones are what they call drifters, and they drift about on the ocean currents, but doing similar things, but slightly restricted, although some of them are pretty fancy. And actually, just dwelling on the drifter buoys, is a chart here of the global drifter array. Now, the drifter array is a truly global thing, which countries participate in and own some of these drifting buoys. But you can see there's something like, well, over 1,500 buoys around at the moment, releasing information, weather information, oceanographic information, and the like. And there's also another plan called Argo, and Argo floats, some people may have heard of, but there's even more of these. There's nearly 4,000 floats around the planet, and these are particularly clever because they're actually measuring in some detail oceanographic conditions. So they have a lot of information available for people who are studying climate and climate change in particular, because they're looking at how the oceans are varying over time. Observations from land, also important in the forecasting process. This is a typical meteorological enclosure at a Met Office site. In fact, this is Coldrose. Lots of equipment in here, ranging from the standard Stevenson screen, where thermometers are housed, a cloud-based recorder in this box here, visiometer measuring visibility, rain gauges, and all sorts of other various equipment for the information. And that comes together in coded form. These little plots on here are called synoptic observations. Again, the bread and butter of the first steps of forecasting, gathering the information at first hand. And first step in really putting the forecast together. Combine that with some internet data and local knowledge, and you start to get the first ideas of what the day is going to present for you. Weather radar is another very good one as well. That's been around for quite a few years now, since the late 70s, early 80s, something like that. It's really evolved. It's links in now with something called numerical weather prediction. So it's all taken into the computer that churns out computerized forecasts and gives some really good, accurate information. And it's really can give you an idea of how weather fronts are behaving, showers are behaving, and so much more information. There are limitations to it, but in general, it's a very reliable system. Brings me on neatly to sort of computer modeling products, really. The computer model is the main one in the UK is held by the Met Office. Now, in days before computer modeling, we had to do by hand. In fact, the very first computer model was pretty much done by hand. The irony, of course, it was known that these equations, which are Sutcliffe's equations of development, would actually help forecast the weather. So someone actually sat down with these and a grid of data, but it took him about 5 years to do a forecast for 6 hours ahead, which clearly is a problem. So things have actually moved on, and numerical weather prediction As I say, it was first attempted in the 1920s, which was a bit of an early failure, to be honest. But gradually, as computers started to come to the fore, then they could apply the mathematical calculations and start to actually input real-time data and start to actually work out what was going to happen in the future. The first one's really rudimentary, and the time we got to when I started forecasting in the early 80s, the computer at the Met Office probably had the same sort of computing power as your average laptop does now. So that's how fast things are moving. They began, the 5-day forecast back in the early 80s wasn't particularly accurate, and nowadays it's pretty accurate, although there are some weather situations that are handled better than others. Just dwelling on that for a minute, computer models, because they're configured to, I suppose, the average weather conditions. In other words, I spoke about all our weather coming from the southwest. Well, they do like to crunch on weather flows that come from the southwest. Ones that bug them are the ones that come from the east, where they're not used to. They're not necessarily programmed in the same detail, if you like, for that. So our recent spell of warm weather dominated by easterly winds has been quite a tricky one, particularly as far as forecasting when it's going to end. So that's the way it looks in terms of a model. It's a grid, a mathematical grid, I suppose, but the globe is divided up into varying degrees of resolution, ranging from 25 kilometers, which is quite broad, low resolution, to just 1.5 kilometers for a small scale computer model. And these are the sort of coverage areas. The red here is the European model. The blue is the global model, funny old thing. And here in the middle is the UK model, which is the highest resolution model that the Met Office actually produces. But it is a variable resolution model and can be transferred to any region they want to, which is particularly useful for its military customers. And then this is ensemble forecasting, which is using the computer model. But when you ask the computer to run and say, right, go forecast now, I've put in the information at the start. Now this is time for you to actually go and crunch it out. If you vary the starting point by subtle amounts, then you'll get different answers at the end of it. And ensemble forecasting is look at those different answers and then mashing them together statistically to actually come up with the best solution. Bit of white man's magic, if you like. I don't necessarily understand exactly all the process going on in between, but that's essentially what ensemble forecasting is. And they can compare it with other models around the bazaars as well. Computer models, this was October 97, the Great Storm, Michael Fish's greatest moment, which I said I'd probably mention briefly. I think I'll leave it at that. But this is the low in October 1987 that caused the strong winds, which was forecast then by the computer model as it existed to go to the south over northern France, but obviously it didn't. We've learned a lot, not only about computer modeling from this particular episode, but also about meteorology, because there was a particular meteorological process going on in this particular event, which few people at that stage really understood, or even more so could understand to the point of forecasting it. So that's why it was really a bit of a learning point as well as a bit of a failure as far as forecasting was concerned. But an awful lot came out of it. And nowadays things have improved quite a bit. This is the latest computer in the Met Office called Cray XE40. Sort of a few details there about what it actually does. 2 petabytes of memory and storage of 24 petabytes. So if you know what a petabyte is, it's a million gigabytes, I think, is the petabyte. So a bit more powerful than your average smartphone. And these are sort of products it produces. So going back to the day-to-day forecasting, this is a chart of forecast wind speed and wind gust over the southwest of England. Now, these are really useful products for forecasting. When you come to the writing the forecast an hour and a half before you go live on radio, these are the sort of things that are nice to actually give you a feel, because it's very graphical. It tells you in terms of wind speed and gust quite easily what's going to be happening over the course of the day. And you get several of these charts for every hour, in fact, depending on which particular model you actually use for it. So that's particularly useful. This is even more so. They look like satellite pictures, but these are all computer generated. So this is model information in terms of cloud, rain, and wind all lumped together, but it's done in a way that's presentable to the forecaster and indeed the public, I suppose, to some extent. You will see these sort of charts on not just Spotlight, but on the national television. They are simplified to some extent, but as forecasters, they're also very useful as well. You can see from this particular example, then you've got 3 hourly frames going from 9 o'clock in the morning, or 9 Zulu, up into midnight the same night. So that's the sort of the computer-assisted aid, if you like, if you've got to weather forecasting. And then it's a question of really sitting down, writing scripts, and off you go and forecast. It's always interesting when you've got some severe weather about, and it's always interesting when you've got some headlines like these to contend with as well. I can't just pick on the Daily Express here. It's not really fair, because a lot of the tabloid newspapers will do this. They just get a breeze of an indication that some sort of severe weather is on the way. And there are a lot of internet companies out there, providers, and some of the main players as well, who will push out weather forecasts, which can be pretty scary if you take certain words of the forecast and then transfer them into a headline. I have to say, on a lot of occasions, these just don't work out. They've picked out some of the main points, but they've not really absorbed the detail in them. They sell newspapers. That's the key. I'm told, I don't know how reliable this is, but I'm told that circulation of newspapers goes up something like 25% if there's a weather headline on the front. So, as I say, I just can't pick out the Daily Express on that, because the other tabloids and some of the larger news sheets are also prone to fall foul of this as well. Changing climate, also something people are very concerned about, like to hear about. I'm not a climatologist, I'm a meteorologist. There is a subtle difference, but we do have one eye on what the climatologists are saying. A lot of people are interested in the effects on not just the community, but also the landscape as well. We're seeing, I think it's fair to say, periods of exceptional weather, drought, flood, close on the heels of each other. Maybe we've got that coming up at the moment. Talking about the meandering jet stream, if I've got time, I'll talk a little about that as well. So these are the sort of problems that we're facing: droughts, floods, unseasonal weather. And the jet stream, as I say, is normally our meandering flow of air driving our weather systems around the planet. But when it becomes a bit more buckled in terms of, and it meanders a little more north or south, then that's where it starts to cause problems. And changing climate is part of the reason I think people think this is happening, because of the temperature difference or contrast between the poles and the equator, which is why the jet stream exists in the first place. And changes of the shape of the jet stream ultimately can seriously affect seasonal weather patterns. The chart I'm showing you now is one of the jet stream this morning, in fact, from a computer-generated chart, just to orientate yourselves here. The United Kingdom is where the mouse pointer is, and this is the core of strong winds here is the jet stream. Sorry, I'll go back one. That is the jet stream. Now, up until recently, that has been further east. And what is interesting is this omega-type shape to the jet stream is something that's actually called a block situation. It means that the jet stream is buckled to the point where it's actually created this omega-type situation. Anyone knows their geomorphology in oxbow lakes and the like will know how they get cut off and they're very slow moving. Well, that's what happens in the jet stream terminology as well. And when you get one of these shapes of jet stream over the UK, affecting the UK, then the weather pattern persists, and it can persist for weeks. And we had such a block over us for a little while recently, but there are signs that it's beginning to break down now. If all else fails, there's always weather law. I always talk about weather law, not in any great depth today, though, but there are plenty of sayings out there that are based on experience rather than science necessarily. The idea of rain before 7, fine before 11 is quite a good one for the southwest of England on a typical day when you've got a frontal system advancing over the southwest. It works quite well. Oh, too far ahead. Sorry, there we go. So online weather. just going to mention this because I think it might create a few questions. Very popular. A lot of people get their weather online now, both in smartphone form or laptops. A lot of information out there from a lot of countries. Some of them have freedom of information, therefore it's a free service. Some of them don't. And if you really want to get the detailed information, you probably have to part with some cash, but not all by any means. Here are some just to talk about. Windy, TY, so some really good weather sites in here. Some of these I use on a day-to-day basis for forecasting. Meteor Blue, another one, good one for aviation forecasts, any amateur pilots around. Wind Gurus, quite popular with fishermen and the like for their the way it's actually presented, at least. XC Weather, another popular one with the fishing community or sailing community as well, because it's very much an indication of what's happening wind hour by hour or 3 hour by 3 hour period. Weather Online, and I've got to mention the BBC, of course. But it just brings me to a bit of a government health warning. When you not just look at the BBC weather site, but also the other weather sites, make sure you go down into the detail. The BBC one in particular, you get a nice headline at the top of the page, showing us what it's going to be like Friday to Tuesday. You need to dig down it, otherwise you can get misled sometimes. And the main thing is just be aware that internet forecasts, there's a very, very little, if any, human intervention as far as the, I wouldn't say the quality, but what goes into it. It can be a high quality product, but there's no human intervention in it at all. It's all computer generated. There's another one, MetCheck. Weather Underground gives some actual information done by amateur weather observers around the county. That's quite useful, particularly in frost days. And the UK Met Office have weather observations web as well, very similar to the Weather Underground one, where amateur meteorologists, rather, with their own weather stations are actually through the internet getting them reported online. BBC Weather Watchers comes coupled with a lot of lovely pictures, which are great for TV, and myself on social media as well. It always helps highlight a forecast, and the mobile apps are the other ones as well. So that was a very quick ramble through. I hope that was understandable and understandable and enjoyable. These are the contact details, my Twitter account, BBC Cornwall's Twitter account, and as I promised, I am going to mention the charity which I support. Every talk I do at the moment, then this is the slide I throw up. And why is it there? The backup there is basically a spinal cord charity. They're there to support and encourage people who have recently become spinally cord injured, and it ranges from the very young to the very old. They help everyone, and it's a very challenging time. If you have been spinally cord injured, then you believe sometimes that the world is just ending around you, but their job and what they do very successfully through a mentoring program and provision of courses is encourage people to get back on their proverbial feet again, and to get them back into work, get them back into enjoying themselves, getting back into living as well. And the reason I say that is because my daughter was spinally cord injured in 2009, and she was helped by the Backup Trust when she was in hospital. A mentor came to her when she was feeling at her lowest, and they got it out to the point where she rejoined her university. She graduated, she went abroad to study, and subsequently got a full-time job with the same charity that helped her in London. And this is me, her, and my son carrying her with a team on a wheelchair to the top of Snowdon. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the show. So I'm going to stop my share now, and I think it's going to be over to you.
Right. Well, thank you, Kevin. That was absolutely information-packed, and I'm hesitate to guess what kind of questions we're going to get. I've certainly got a few of my own. Just in case, there may be one or two people who've not been to Zoom discussions before or haven't been to the virtual cafe site. At the bottom of your screen, pretty much in the center, there's a little button that says chat.
Ah, yes.
And if you click on that, it will open up to, I think for most people on the right of the screen, a place where you can type in any particular questions that you have. And I and my colleagues will be combing through those to make sure that that we've picked up as many questions as we can. I should say that if anybody is interested in actually coming on screen, we can simply click on you and allow you to, so you can actually talk in the flesh, or at least 2D. But and it is a lot quicker than typing a lengthy question, by the way. So whilst giving you a moment or so to formulate any thoughts and questions you have, I will just again come back to Kevin's mention of the backup trust. Those of you registering on Eventbrite may or may not have noticed that we've now introduced the option of a donations box. Otherwise, our talks are entirely for free. But if people do feel minded to donate something to what would be our charity of the month, that will be your opportunity in subsequent weeks to give a little back, to give something in gratitude or reflecting how much you think you've enjoyed or got something out of it. So most people, I imagine, won't have done that on the way in today, but that will be the charity of the month for the rest of June. So those of you who are frequent flyers here and are regular attenders, all of those coming new, that's where you can make your own contribution over and above the questions. Right, so let's now start. I think I'll begin with just working my way through the questions as they've come. We may need to start compositing things as they start to cover some territory. Sophie didn't realise there was a different Met Office where the forecast would come from, and was there a particular reason for the BBC changing to Meteo Group? She's right, that is the name of the group. She had a reminder. Is there a requirement that you must have a soothing voice? You can take both of those two together, I think.
I can take, first of all, the soothing voice. Soothing and putting someone to sleep is probably something you don't want to do. I have been told that I have got a soothing voice, and one of the things you have to do when you join the BBC as a presenter is provide a voice or a sound test, which I had to do. And people have actually said before that I should do radio. One day before I was actually sitting in Gibraltar in the Navy when I was working there, and I phoned up the dentist to book an appointment, and I got hold of the main man, the dentist, and I left it. He wasn't in, so I left a message on his answer phone. Anyway, he called me back with the response, and he said, "Oh, by the way, you give good phone," which can be taken in a multitude of ways, but I took it as a compliment. Anyway, come back to the more important point there about Meteor Group and the BBC. Yep, we did change providers from 2018 from the UK Met Office, which had been the provider for the BBC for ever since the BBC was probably organised and took an interest in weather forecasts. But the BBC has a charter, and the charter is very much something that requires us to be responsible to the public in terms of what we do, and something called the BBC Trust, and it demands we get best value for money. And the BBC's contract with the Met Office came up in 2018 for renewal, and so what the charter is required to do is to tender for data provision, and the Met Office duly rendered a tender, and as other firms were invited to do that as well. So it does come down to money in the end, but there's also quality. And for whatever reason, the Meteor Group came up clearly with a cheaper option, but we're able to actually provide data for the requirement of our forecasts as well. So that was what the charter is obliged to do: get best value for money for public consumption. I leave it in the hands of the customers to whether they get that value for money and the quality. I hope they do, but that's how it came about. And I think the Met Office did miss it as far as not having the national broadcaster as one of their contracts. They have, believe me, the Met Office are a huge company in many ways. They might be non-publicly funded, but they are a government agency at the end of the day, closely linked with the Ministry of Defence, which is where a lot of their money does actually come from, and other world organisations, be they media, military, or whatever.
Right, that's an interesting behind-the-scenes view. And am I right from something that you said, that Meteo aren't just taking data from the Met Office, but they do have other sources they're collating and curating in their own way?
They can take data from anywhere they're prepared to pay for, basically. And it doesn't matter whether it's a German, French, Australian, New Zealand, American. They have agreements and provision of that data. They also take data from the Met Office, which is quite ironic, really. But I presume they pay for that. But we see a lot of the data we used to see when the Met Office had the contract through the Media Group as well. So that's why I was saying that sort of little has changed, really, in terms of what we actually get in terms of data.
Before we let you off the hook on the question about a soothing voice, it's worth mentioning that you get quite a lot of teasing on the breakfast show from Julian and James, that you seem to take it all in good heart.
I actually get emails and comments on Twitter from people who've been listening to the program and actually feel sorry for me sometimes. I think people should realise a lot of it is kind of in jest, really, not just the ribbing, but also the fact that I'm kind of playing the fool guy in some ways, which I'm happy to do. I do get a chance to actually turn the tables every now and then. Sometimes I'm not quite as comfortable with it, but
yes, but, I've seen you give back.
Yeah, it does happen like that. Yeah.
Right. So, any other questions about the craft of being a radio or broadcaster weatherman? We may come back to that later. For the moment, you said that you're a trained meteorologist. Also, what was it? An oceanographer and
hydrographic surveyor.
Hydrographic surveyor. Are all weather presenters trained in that way, or are some of them simply reading off the screen? This is an opportunity for you to shop your colleagues.
I can't shop them individually because I don't know them all individually, but the BBC ones in the Southwest are all meteorologists, which I'm happy to say. It's just a quirk of fate in some ways, because around the country working for the BBC, there are people who are presenters who've become latterly trained in rudiments of meteorology to the point where they can actually go on TV and present a weather forecast. That can be done. The questioning bit is probably something that's not going to necessarily work with someone who's not meteorologically trained, although they do require a lot of information once you've done it for a few years, to be honest, and you read the various information articles that come with the weather forecast that you actually present. But my personal opinion is you cannot beat being a meteorologist. And if you've got the happy coincidence of being able to present as well, then you're probably quid in all round. And I suppose, I mean, David Brain is ex-Navy, I'm ex-Navy, and there are a multitude of ex-Navy forecasters out there still doing some media work. And one of the reasons maybe for that is that we have spent a lot of years in our naval careers presenting weather forecasts, not just to individuals, but to groups of people. I'm thinking aviators in particular. A lot of our weather is consumed, or weather forecasts are consumed by people about to go flying in the most challenging, difficult of situations. And you've got to stand in front of them and convince them that the weather is actually going to be what you say, to the point where they're happy to go and step in their aircraft or their helicopter and actually go flying in what can be quite a challenging, dangerous situation.
So that's going to, yes, learning your craft. And I'm hoping we're going to come on to the question about how much craft there is in forecasting at some point. If not, I'll have to ask myself. Martin Wren Hilton asked, to what extent do movements of the moon affect the weather? I think we could throw in sunspots and other such extraterrestrial events as well.
I don't know much on the detail, but I do know, picking up information from some very eminent scientists, that sunspots are believed to have an effect on weather. Some people I think Piers Corbyn in particular with his weather company have actually made a living on forecasting sunspot activity and relating it to long-term forecasts. Some people poo-poo it. I don't think people have necessarily disproved it as a means to do it as well. Solar flares. I mean, there is an active branch of the UK Met Office which is actually entitled Space Weather. That's not necessarily the weather that's going on in space, of which there's very little, but it's the impact of spatial events on the weather with our planet that they're actually looking at. So things like solar flares, for example, sunspot activity, which lead to solar flares in some cases, are things they actively look at in terms of how they're going to affect the forecast, be it long-term, short-term, because they can have major effects. I think not so long ago, we heard about the potential damaging effects of solar flare activity on things like electronic chips, the various chips that go, and the fact they could all be fried by an electromagnetic flare from space. So very interesting, very critical type of stuff. And yes, there is this department in the UK Met Office trying to get to the bottom of space weather for our benefit.
Piers Corbyn there, brother of the more famous Jeremy.
That's the one, yeah.
The one, the sunspot man. So far, I'm actually going to read these questions just as they come pretty much in sequence because they're not clustering that much. Is the BBC actually the best site to go for weather for the average user, the average consumer?
It's not a bad place to start, to be honest. I think it's a lot of people's choice, but there's so much out there. And if I was advising someone on what the best weather site to go to, I'd be inclined to list probably about, I don't know, half a dozen to a dozen, which I regularly use, and say, which one do you actually like the look of? And then once you actually like the look of it, you can start comparing them in terms of maybe quality. Quality is a really difficult thing to assess with a website, to be honest. So you need a sort of lot of dedication to actually write down what the forecast was and then compare it with what it actually turned out like. There's a lot of perception involved in weather forecasting as a consumer, that is. Someone's sunny intervals and the occasional shower is someone's, I've been sat under a shower all day and it's been pouring. So there's a lot of perception involved, which makes the assessment of websites quite difficult. But the BBC is a good place to start, I'd have to say.
Okay, we do have a rider to that. Sophie asking, are you allowed to say anything else if you have a contract with the BBC? Shame on you, Sophie. Surely you wouldn't suggest that our speaker is...
I have to be very politically correct, of course, when it comes to the BBC. Balanced is the way. There are good websites out there. There are some not so good websites around there. I would always urge people to actually look at as many as you can and find out what pleases them best.
And what about long-range weather forecasts? Are there any particular sites that you would tend to favour for that? Piers Corbyn, of course, is a long-range man.
I don't think I would, actually, to be honest. I really wouldn't, whether it was the Met Office, the BBC, anything beyond 5, maybe 7 days now is so difficult to actually put any credence in. Sometimes there are situations, I mentioned talking about blocking situations. There are situations where you can say, okay, this situation, the weather situation we have is going to persist for 2-3 weeks. That can happen, but most situations are quite fluid. The atmosphere is essentially a chaotic thing, and forecasting in 5 days in a chaotic medium like the atmosphere is pretty good going, actually. And with the advance of computer technology, the bigger computers that are being thrown at this particular problem, then you're beginning to get more accurate forecasts out to 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 days, something like that. But beyond that, this is why these newspaper headlines come about, the ones I showed you, the fact that they sometimes shout from the rooftop that this winter is going to be snowmageddon, or the summer is going to be red hot, barbecue summer. Oops, did I mention the barbecue summer? So you can get into a dreadful mire by doing that. And I've looked at a lot of long-term forecasts in my job, and I look at them on a daily basis. The other thing I notice on a daily basis is that they all change. daily as well. The long-term theme changes from maybe one that's looking wet and windy to one that's maybe looking fairly innocuous. So I couldn't possibly go on air in weather forecasts each day and say, well, the long-term forecast is looking as though it's going to be raining cats and dogs by day 10 to 12. And then tomorrow, well, forget all that. It's all changed. It's now looking dry and sunny. I just look a mug. So I never do it. I'll stick to the 5 days. Thank you.
A related question here. I'm starting to zip to and fro in the chat questions here. Many of the forecasting models use machine learning. What I'm thinking is that you can only learn if you're gathering data about the past and comparing that with what you thought were the best available collective calculations. But the amount of data, the number of correlations that you would need to do to actually expand that to any significant degree, even without the peculiar geography that we have here, that you can intuitively feed into, but statistically you would have to as well. What kind of computing power is necessary to extend predictions beyond, say, 4 or 5 days?
It's a bit like, I mean, one analogy I use quite a lot is if you're a photographer and you want to take increasingly better photographs, then you spend more and more money on your camera. And then you get to the point where you're getting a really good photograph, and then you've got to spend another £2,000–3,000 in order to improve that photograph just a little bit. So it's almost an exponential type curve. And weather forecasting are much the same. You get to the point where you 20, 30 years ago, you'd spend not a huge amount, but you got actually a really big increase in your quality of weather forecasts. And then as that quality started to not peak, but slow in terms of improvement, you could spend a shed load more money, but not actually, you get an improvement, but not as big as you did before. And that's the case at the moment. You've actually got to throw an awful lot of money at the computer, the supercomputer, in order to be able to get any sort of significant improvement whatsoever. The next supercomputer has already been ordered, I think, from the Met Office at a cost of something like 1.2 billion. It's not cheap, that sort of computing power. I bear in mind that when I started weather forecasting and I was looking at 5-day forecasts, the computer that did that, I probably now hold in my hand on a daily basis on a smartphone. It's just ridiculous.
So there's that famous law about how computing power expands or doubles, whatever it is, every year. But meanwhile, the complexity of weather has a fractal increase. Linked question here. Granted that, where do you see weather forecasting going in the future? It's difficult enough to predict 5 days ahead with the weather, but can you predict how weather forecasting is evolving?
Well, first of all, I think there's a lot of time and energy for the human interface. A lot of consumption of weather forecasts is still through television and radio. A lot of it is online as well. And I've mentioned when we were talking about online forecasts, a lot of that has no human intervention whatsoever. And that's worth knowing. Where do I think it's going to go in the future? Well, I think online will still continue to gather pace. And as far as the accuracy is concerned, well, yes, that will continue to pick up slowly. And we may see in our lifetime quite easily accurate forecasts out to 10 days or more starting to develop. Hopefully there will still be people on radio and television presenting it as well.
You won't be replaced by robots in a while. Okay. Yes, one of the questions I was going to go to after that. In terms of the craft of putting together the data and the statistical predictions compared with your own knowledge of particularly a coastline like Cornwall's, how long does it take to put together a single weather forecast?
Right. Well, if I give you an idea, this is a normal day before COVID took effect. I would be in the office at about 4:30 in the morning. My first live broadcast would be at 5 o'clock. So in half an hour, I've got to come up with a form of words. Okay, it's only a short forecast, the first one. The first one of any length is actually at 6:15. So you could argue I've got around about an hour and 3/4 to actually put a forecast together. And it's important to note that it is me putting the weather forecast together. I'm not taking a printed sheet off the internet and just simply reading it. It is available, but it's very terse, it's short, and it doesn't really give the sort of flavour I want to spin on the weather forecast for Cornwall. I want to try and include a little bit of local flavour into it, because that's exactly what happens in Cornwall. That's why I'm here. No other radio station, apart from Radio Devon, which I serve, has their own dedicated weather forecaster. All the other radio stations in the BBC are provided by their weather with what's called a weather hub. So it's remotely sourced. It comes in either pre-recorded or live from someone not sitting necessarily in that particular county or area the radio station is serving. So we're very fortunate in Cornwall in that respect. So I'm taking about, I don't know, an hour and a half really to put the full forecast together. So it's a whole 5-day forecast, starting from scratch, a blank piece of paper, and starting with the information as I indicated, looking around you, seeing what the local conditions are like, and then with the aid of the various computer products, applying the forecast information onto that, and then coming up with a form of words that is not too technical, but understandable, and hopefully representing what I think the forecast is going to be.
Okay, I'm going to follow up that a little bit more with a question of my own, but meanwhile, Henry's just asked, when you present, I think this is a good question in terms of the craft, when you present a forecast, do you have a prompt, or do you have to actually remember and then ad-lib?
I do have a piece of paper in front of me which has a script on it. That script is not for me. The script is for the newsreaders, the presenters. You know, if I was to fall over, break a leg or something like that, then they've got something to carry on with, essentially. But it's something I can use as a key sort of kind of keyword jogger. But no, it's all up there, and it sometimes comes out in fairly garbled form. But I do ad-lib a lot. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So there's quite a thespian streak that you have to have.
Yes. Yeah, the thought of performing on stage in a pantomime or something like that would scare me rigid, but somehow being behind a microphone and presenting something that's well within my comfort zone as far as knowledge goes, that doesn't scare me too much. I might have done when I first started, but it doesn't at the moment.
Okay, I've got a couple of connections I want to try and draw out now. So I'm going to have another question on my. Granted, we are talking about Cornwall. Are there parts of Cornwall that are particularly hard to call? Are there some areas where it's just so full of wild cards that you...
I thought we could say wild people for a minute. No, it very much it's very much dependent on the weather situation. Horses for courses, I suppose, is the best phrase I can come up with. There are some situations which affect parts of Cornwall in different ways. But going back to what I said in the presentation, one thing I suppose is more challenging is the data sparse areas, where you know something's going on, but you don't quite know what, because the only thing you can see that gives you an indication of what's happening is maybe a satellite picture or something like that. And that is essentially the nearest we can get to ground truthing if you haven't got any person out there telling you exactly what's going on. So the obvious situation, for example, here's a good one. The Isles of Scilly at the moment. Now, the Isles of Scilly normally have a full-time weather observer at the airport who's observing every hour from early in the morning till early evening or late evening. But unfortunately, his kit is broken at the moment, so there is nothing coming out of the Isles of Scilly whatsoever in official weather reports, which can make life particularly interesting, particularly if we have sea fog and the like, because sea fog not just affects people who happen to be in Scilly and maybe expecting or hoping for a sunny day, but there's a more important aspect to this in terms of how do things get taken to the Isles of Scilly, be it human, be it freight. They go by sea or they go by air. If you've got low cloud fog in Scilly, but you haven't really got a fix on where it is and when it's how thick it is, then it can be really difficult. But it is going to affect the transport, the mode of transport, particularly aviation. They quite often have to pull the service because of poor visibility or low cloud.
Yeah, the sun is cut off. So areas like Bodmin Moor, say, or large land, or I'm thinking, I'm in Falmouth, so we have the whole Fal estuary with a different balance between water and how that holds heat and reflects light and creates additional offshore breezes and so on. Presumably that's something that only local knowledge allows you to factor that in to the kind of statistics that are otherwise predicting.
Well, if you, when I was talking about how I do a lot of these talks, and no matter where I go, people are very proud of their own little microclimate that they happen to have. And some of them I understand through when I was forecasting at Cold Rose for military aviation. You do get a good handle on some of these local effects. I can mention one, but it's one of many. For example, in the St Ives area, going towards Mounts Bay, there's something called what we call the St Ives Gap, and you could have fog and low cloud in St Ives Bay. Otherwise, so gin clear on the south coast. But if a little bit of a breeze sprang up, it would favour blowing the mist and the low cloud through the St Ives Gap into Mounts Bay, such that Penzance started to get misty and foggy, as well as St Ives. So that was a sort of little local phenomena that happened. Not to mention the various breezes that spring up. One in the Helford, for example, the easterly breeze in the Helford can be very light. In Falmouth, it can be light on the Lizard, but through Helford, because of the funneling, the Venturi effect, over the top of, once that wind starts coming up the end of the Helford Valley, it's blowing at about 20-25 miles an hour. Those sort of things you do become aware of over time. But there's an awful lot of them, I have to say, and I can't begin on a routine weather forecast on Radio Cornwall to mention all of them. But they do form interesting talking points. If you can identify one and it's affecting the weather, and it's also interesting, then I will quite often feed that into the situation and talk about it.
Mm-hmm. And whilst we're on that interplay of geography and thermodynamics, I suppose, isn't it? The movement of air and how it swirls and backs up and so on. One of the questions from earlier on that I was trying to work my way back to through this interplay of geography and airflow. Are the forecasting models still largely based on the Sutcliffe equations that you mentioned earlier on, or has statistical modelling now moved on to the point where it's left them behind or just added further layers of sophistication?
Well, the Sutcliffe equation was the basics of the first computer models. They were subsequently reworked by a very eminent meteorologist who worked for the Met Office, and that's a pretty clever thing to do. But those were reworked, and the new computer models use the reworked equations. So they form still the basis. Mathematics still forms the basis of computer modeling. But an interesting point you mentioned there about historical aspects of it. One of the ways of actually coming up with a long-term forecast, which is still done, I believe, but was probably used more so in recent years, was the one which compared the current situation, and then they trawled back through historical records, as far as they could have. And in our country, they go back to the early 1900s. And they try to compare the current situation with the situation that existed in history. And I thought, okay, well, if you've got the same situation that happened then surely we can look at that situation and then see what happened 2 weeks from there. We've got a fair idea what's going to happen 2 weeks from now if they're comparable situations. It's not used so much now, but I think climatologists are prone to use it. And it didn't necessarily come up with a great deal of accuracy, because there are, a bit like the butterfly effect, which people may be familiar with, the Amazon butterfly flaps its wings and changes climate around the world in a year's time, something like that. But yeah, that just reminded me to talk about that as a method of long-term forecasting as well.
Okay, now I know you slipped in a throwaway line about the jet stream at one point there, but so far no one's actually asked about that. I better be dutiful and stick with asking questions that have been asked. Two of them that I think are very different sides of the same coin. Steve asked, as wind turbines become increasingly common, do they have a measurable effect on the weather, locally or otherwise? And we also had a question earlier on about air traffic and excessive air traffic, the extent to which, so that's two man-made phenomena, both relatively contemporary. Do we see their effects? Do they vary in terms of how they affect things?
As far as wind turbines, I'm not aware of any sort of national effect. Local effect, I'm sure there are effects. You can't put up a forest of wind turbines in an area and not expect some sort of change, albeit small, to the local climate. So what was the other aspect of the question, Robin? Sorry?
Air traffic.
Air traffic, yes. I think it's long been understood that anything that's flying around in the upper atmosphere, that is essentially an engine chucking out a certain amount of pollution. Not all engines are super polluting, but nonetheless they're putting otherwise foreign objects into a fairly sensitive part of the atmosphere. And one aspect which is immediate is condensation trails, vapor trails, whatever you want to call them. On certain situations, weather situations, will amplify and form cloud of their own, and they will actually shield the sun and will affect the weather directly. On an otherwise clear sunny day with no cloud, a couple of aircraft flying along, because conditions are favorable for aircraft trails, then suddenly you've got a load of cloud and it's not quite so sunny anymore. So that is one immediate effect of aircraft. I know a lot of people are sort of quite vexed about the longer term and effects on things like ozone and the like aircraft have by simply flying through those sort of levels. I know there's a lot of people who feel very strongly about aircraft, and they shouldn't be flying at all, really, because of the effect they have on the climate. I'm not sure that's necessarily proved how devastating it is yet. Time will tell, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of that kind of effect, what about things like cloud seeding?
Cloud seeding
is it a phenomenon? Does it really?
Yeah, it is a phenomenon. Famously, the Chinese were rumored to have carried it out for the Olympic Games in Beijing, I think, in order to prevent thunderstorms or whatever falling over Olympic venues. How successful they were, I have no idea. The Americans have apparently dabbled in it as well, on a fairly small scale basis. Well, if they've been successful, they're sure as hell not telling us. But I think the suspicion is that they've not worked particularly well. I think silver iodide, certain particles is released into various clouds, and the idea is that they form condensation nuclei and allow water to condense on them, form clouds, which may be allowed to grow more in terms of vertical extent than they would have otherwise if they hadn't been seeded. So yeah, it's been done, but I'm not sure it's been very successful.
So is it that it is meteorologically credible, but just highly unpredictable?
Certainly unpredictable, yeah. I say, as far as the credibility goes, I reserve judgment on people who actually sort of carry it out and whatever results they've had with it. Periodically, you see the occasional article in learned magazines about cloud seeding, but there's a lot of speculation because the countries that do it aren't necessarily voluptuous with the truth. So,
voluptuous with the truth. That's a lovely phrase. Okay, you did mention the jet stream, though, as something that you might want to come back to at some point. And it's the image that you showed us there showed a rather nicely regular, curvely, sort of doily-like shape, and yet at the same time you get these oxbows.
Yep.
So, how much do we actually really understand?
More and more, actually, with regard to the jet stream. Its impact on climate change is still being sort of worked upon. There's a feeling, one school of thought at the moment is that with the temperature contrast, and the temperature contrast between poles and the equator is where the power, the energy of the jet stream comes from. The stronger that contrast is, the stronger the jet stream. If the pole's warm and the equator stays warm, then the temperature contrast weakens. And if it weakens, the school of thought is that the jet stream weakens, and it is also more liable to meander. And if it meanders, then it's more likely to form these sort of standing waves that actually may reverse our normal weather patterns from, say, west to east, so east to west. And it also has, so it's speculated, another impact in terms of the oceanographic currents. So if the jet stream becomes disorientated, then the surface water currents in the Atlantic, as an example, also start to be affected because they're heavily driven by the jet stream as well, believe it or not, or at least standard surface winds and the Earth's rotation, all combining. And the North Atlantic Drift is our probably major current that keeps the British Isles in the climate it enjoys. And if the jet stream did start to change on a permanent basis, then the supposition is that the North Atlantic current would also change eventually. And if that changed, then our climate would ultimately obviously change as well. But what to? I don't know, but suspicion is it would become more continental in influence. So, maybe hot summers, cold winters, that sort of thing, as a basic supposition.
Okay, we're not getting a flood of questions coming through, and I believe that we've touched on just about everything that we've been asked, although maybe I could ask one of my colleagues to have a scan through and see if there's anything that we haven't come up with there. Yes, one question I was going to ask, you mentioned the local weather watchers. They always get a look in. They always get a sort of appreciative mention. How significant is that kind of very local feedback to you? Is it something you encourage because it's a sort of audience participation thing?
It is
adding knowledge.
It is audience participation for the most part. It can be a game changer from sometimes because they're loyal souls. These are weather watchers. There are about 4 or 5 of them, and they provide a daily weather report each morning. And it does fall into the category of ground truthing, which is one of the more important things you need as a weather forecaster. But at the same time, they have all formed characters, and I think just about everybody who listens to the program when they're on has their own mind's eye picture of what Rob in Alton looks like, or Jeff in Polzeth, and all the rest of it, and Dick in Coverack, and all the rest of them. And they have formed a sort of belonging to the program, which we're keen to preserve, and they're keen to partake in as well. In fact, one of my once we actually get released from this lockdown, which may be some time yet, I don't know, is to actually do a tour of our weather watchers and bring them to life, bring a bit of colour to them, and actually do some interviews and take some pictures. And so I hope it won't ruin people's perception too much. But my plan is to actually sort of make not a bigger part of the programme, but actually explain to people who they are, what they do, why they do it.
Well, my fantasy was some kind of Christmas pantomime in which they actually do get a walk-on part.
Well, at our Christmas concert we did 2 or 3 years ago, we did a song together, myself and the weather watchers. We all came together and we did a Christmas song, which is probably in the vaults somewhere. never to be heard again.
Oh, fish that out for us, Kevin.
Yeah.
I think that it may have missed its time to go viral then, but golden oldies can come back. We do have a couple more questions come through. Henry says he thinks we're seeing more easterly wind in the last few years, not just in the last few weeks or so. Is that the case, or is that just a perception?
Well, I don't have the stats at hand, so I can't confirm. It may be a perception thing, but then again, there may be a reality. It's my perception as a weather forecaster, that we seem to get these periods in a summer, maybe even in the winter. We all remember the Beast from the East, but it's my perception that we do get these prolonged periods where easterlies are set up. And they seem to go on for, well, not quite ever, but a long period of time. Don't they? Yeah, and then we have equally periods where our weather comes from the southwest, and it's just intermittent as far as the rain, the strong winds, and all the rest of it. The spring, early spring and winter, exceptionally wet, and then we get to April and May, and we start to see the easterlies starting to dominate, and we get this period of dry weather, and it looks, if the long-term forecast is to be believed, then we'll swing round to the southwest again by the time 10 days are out, something like that. But it'll be interesting to see if the stats do start to show that, because if it does, then what does it indicate? It probably indicates that our jet stream is maybe already prone to what we call the buckling, and allowing the normal flow of west to east to be disrupted, and we get more of an east to west flow instead.
And that becomes a pattern.
Yeah.
Okay, David asks, we've said that Cornwall is exceptionally exposed with the position, location, and the oddity of some of the shapes of our coastline. But are there other regions in the UK that are equally complicated from a meteorological point of view?
Well, there are. I would suggest probably if I was going out of the United Kingdom slightly to Ireland, I always feel for West Coast of Ireland forecasters who probably struggle with the same sort of issues that we have in Cornwall. Perhaps not so much nowadays with the advent of more reliable computer information and modelling products, but Ireland is one, and the other. Occasionally, the East Coast, the North Sea, can be incredibly problematic. When you get these fog conditions on the East Coast, it's called the Har, and you get these, and it can be locked in for days, depending on the situation. And forecasting the sort of thinning, the thickening of this particular fog, and when it's going to clear permanently, and when it's going to come in, there are empirical rules which it behaves on a diurnal basis, on a sort of what's it doing in the morning and the afternoon. But as far as general perception, it can be quite difficult to do. I think we have it pretty difficult in Cornwall, to be honest, but I always think that one of the reasons why I'm here doing the job in Cornwall and Devon is because of its difficulty, or it doesn't conform necessarily to the sort of more general trends that seem to happen up country. So if you're forecasting, for example, in Cambridgeshire or London, and most of your weather's been over the bulk of England already, and you've got a good idea what's going to happen. But as soon as you get down to Cornwall, all it's got is 3,000 miles of sea between you and the last point of land it left. And by that time, it's changed its characteristics quite a bit.
I suppose the other comparable place on Earth, or at least in Europe, would be Brittany, which also has a similarly, what should we say, erratic coastline, and is exposed in much the same way. Do you actually have any contact with weather forecasters in Brittany, or do we not do that kind of thing?
We don't actually. I mean, we probably had more contact when I was in the Navy. We probably have more contact with other countries' navies through maybe where you worked. I mean, I used to work in London at the principal headquarters in Northwood, and that's where the main weather centre in the armed forces actually is. And we'd have a multitude of foreign forecasters that would come in, and we'd be able to talk, exchange views and ideas, and it was really quite interesting. But we don't on a local scale, certainly now. I mean, I have no call to actually phone up a forecaster in Brittany, and my French is pretty bad, but no call to phone up a forecaster in Brittany and compare notes. It'd be quite interesting, though. It might be an idea for a program one day.
That's another walk-on part then for my fantasy Cornwall Weatherman pantomime. But it also, rather than, one of our people actually is in Brittany, but the weather is very similar, just a tad warmer.
Ideal.
And the cider is just as good. But this also links quite nicely with one of our questions about what was it inspired you? You said that you went into the Navy to become a weatherman. What inspired you to want to become a weatherman and a meteorologist? Was it something you always wanted to do as a child, or?
Not as a. It all started when I was doing my A levels at school, actually, and the geography teacher we had at the time was very interested in meteorology. Now, he clearly was an inspiration to me, because I did a project in A level about the weather, and that led me on to going to university and doing a degree in meteorology, and then on to the Navy to actually do practicing meteorology in terms of forecasting. So I can blame him, I think. Mr. Graham was his name, as I remember, and his infectious enthusiasm and rather sort of eccentric ways of teaching were the things that had the main impact on me.
Does he know how you turned out? Did he?
Yeah, I haven't spoken to him since I left school. I don't even know if he's still around, actually.
That would be an awful lot to predict. Yeah. Okie dokie. Whilst we're on your personal situation, Sophie asks, how does COVID change the time you're going into the? Well, I think I can guess the answer to that. Are you doing a later show? And she also wants to confess that she's not often up at 5:15 to listen to the first one. Do you do a late show? You do half hourly.
I do half-hourly weather forecast in Cornwall, starting at 6:15 in the morning in the current COVID schedule. I start work at 5 o'clock in the morning, and my commute to work is probably about 12 feet, because I'm working from home, and I step over the cat on the landing, hopefully, and I'm at the office, which is actually quite nice, actually. I really got used to the idea of working from home. Whereas before, I'd be working in Truro, probably having to get up, normally about 4 o'clock in the morning. So I'm getting an extra hour in bed in the current regime. And I also got to mention my other job as Radio Devon's weather forecaster, because I do forecast for them each hour at 6:30, 7:30 and 8:30 as well. So I have to switch hats and pretend I'm in a boat in the Tamar and forecast the weather. Interestingly, they've always had a bit of an issue with me being in Cornwall, and they never really mention it on air. That and now over to Kevin for the weather. So they never ask the question. So where are you, Kevin? At the moment? They just refer to him being in the weather studio, which is fine. I'm quite happy with that. But occasionally I'll just be a bit mischievous and just say, well, here in Cornwall the weather is right, and the cat's out the bag.
Do you think they don't quite trust you to
maybe
to be impartial, perhaps?
But now I'm working from home, then they're a little more amenable to the fact that I can talk about where I am. But they prefer it if I just say I'm at home, and just leave the actual location of home a bit of a mystery.
So there we are, folks. 6:15, 6:45 on the hour, just after the traffic announcement as well.
That's right. Be there or be square. I'll be there tomorrow morning.
Right. One last question then coming in, because we're getting close to time to finish. Is there any particular reason as to why we've had such glorious weather the past month? Is it just the luck of the draw and these things happen? It has been extraordinary after all.
Yeah, I can't point to a particular thing and say that's why. Weather is a wonderful rotational thing sometimes. We've gone from the sort of rather wet conditions of January, February, and we've gone to a dry April and May. It does happen. Okay, this time we have broken records. We've had the most sunshine ever recorded. May, statistically, interesting, is reckoned to be the sunniest month of the year. Well, it's certainly proved that this year. But in general, as a general comment, I would say our weather is becoming more volatile. I mean, I think that's something that's proved or borne out by not only perception, but also by statistics now. Weather events tend to be more dramatic, be they, rain events, wind events, or even kind of drought events, I suppose, as well, fall into the same sort of category.
Okay, folks, we're coming up to 7 o'clock, and to my mind, that was an enormously information-packed talk. What I'm going to suggest is that we start to wind up. If we have Sam out there, Sam, are you in a position to just give us a quick indication of next week's talk? I did introduce it saying we're looking at how communities can respond to the science we know about marine pollution through plastics. But Sam, are you out there?
I am. Hello.
Hi, she is.
Yeah, so we've got Emily from Beach Guardian in. She's someone who's on my course, which is how I know her, but you might have seen her on the news. She's done a lot of sort of talks where she's been on BBC Spotlight. And she basically founded an organisation called Beach Guardian, which is based in Cornwall, and they do a lot of beach cleans, and it's all based around working as a community to help tackle the plastic pollution problem. So she's coming in next week, and it's going to be a great talk. So hopefully we'll see some of you again there.
Great. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah. Okay.
She wasn't expecting that.
I wasn't.
Okay. Oh, hold on. We have one last question, not weather related. Sophie, that's exactly what I was about to say. I wanted to remind everybody that we now are providing an opportunity, should we say, to donate. And our charity of the month for the whole of June is going to be, at Kevin's request, the Backup Spinal Injuries Trust. I believe at the moment the only way to do it is next week when you log in to register for our next talk. At that point, although the talk is free, there is the opportunity to donate. Ben, am I right in thinking, I don't think there's a retrospective way we can do that, is there?
Not as yet, but I think it shouldn't take us too much to be able to add something to the website, but just bear with us while we get that sorted.
I'll just say that, Robin, there is the Backup's website is obviously fairly fairly easy to follow, and you can donate on their website.
And David has just pointed out that you can sign up to the Eventbrite site for next week, whether you actually attend or not. So you could make your donation and never actually join the talk. So that would be another quick way in. Right, okay, thanks folks. I think it is probably time to wind up. We've done a bit of a tradition here, that although the audience are largely muted whilst the speaker is talking, we can automatically, just at a flick of a button, we can unmute everybody for a round of thanks and an applause for a brilliant talk. So David, unleash the hounds. Are we there? Are we all unmuted? No, we're not unmuted yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, mute, unmute. There we go.
Laura will do a round of applause.
Oh, thank
you.
Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed your first Zoom talk. I enjoyed that enormously.
Well, in terms of the Zoom phenomena, it was a blast.